Hello and welcome back to Quality Policing, intermittent podcast that I do whenever there's a good reason to do one, and I think now is a good reason. I am Peter Moskos, professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and I'm here today with René Ropac and Stephen Koppel, and they are both senior research associates at the Data Collaborative for Justice, also at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. We're really knocking it out of the park this time. And you both were graciously agreed to come on to help explain to me and the dozens of other listeners or viewers about bail reform. You guys are responsible now for 5 reports looking at New York City bail reform that took effect, passed in 2019 and took effect in late 2019 and in 2020. And bail reform, and correct me anything I say wrong here because you know better than I do, but bail reform is often, it was a big bill, to put it mildly, and it had 3 main elements. The part that specifically dealt with bail reform, which we'll get back to. It also had big changes in discovery reform when prosecutors and what prosecutors have to turn over to the defense team, and also some speedy trial provisions that we won't kind of get into, but that, as far as I know, basically limited how often prosecution can stop the clock in trials. But there was so the 4th report was released in October, the 5th report in November. I'm personally more interested in the 4th report, though I think they overlap or dovetail nicely. The 5th report looks at outside New York City, and it's interesting that there are different effects. The 4th report looks in New York City, and the reason we sort of got together, I mean, René, you've been on this podcast before, so thanks for coming back. There was some online, it's funny how it took a month for it to sort of reach social media, or I mean, not a month, but a week or 2 or 3. Bail reform works, I kept seeing from progressive politicians. And I thought that's a weird thing to say because, first of all, it's too big to say that something bail reform works or doesn't work. There's nuance. And they were very selectively highlighting parts of the executive summary or conclusion and ignoring the next paragraph, which struck me as a bit disingenuous. But if you maybe could just summarize what the findings are and put some context in this for people who are mildly curious about bail reform and don't want to read the report, I guess.
Okay, maybe let's get started on this one. So, I don't want to repeat everything you said, but so we have a total of 5 reports that looked at the impact of bail reform on recidivism, right? And they use different methods that have different advantages, because we tried to look at the issue from different angles. And then we also had separate studies for New York City and the rest of the state because the universe of defendants and prosecutorial behavior is different in the city and upstate. So it made sense to kind of split those analyses. One overarching theme, or one more thing I should say, the four out of those 5 studies looked at what we call initial bail reform. That is the first iteration of bail reform that was in effect during the first half of 2020. In July 2020, major amendments passed that often are referred to as rollbacks of bail reform, that's basically because certain cases that were made bail ineligible during the first half of 2020 became bail eligible once again as a reaction to certain public safety concerns about rising crime, etc. So
let me just interject there and go back even one step further. So that what this means is, so somebody is arrested for a crime and a judge in the old days before this passed could put a cash bail. The main point about bail reform was to eliminate the cash as an option on the argument that that was unfair to poor people. So the judge could have said, you $3,000 bail, you got to find 10%, but if you don't have $300, you would stay in Rikers. Well, if you had that money to pay for bail, you wouldn't. So bail eligible is related to that, but bail reform made a lot of crimes not even eligible for bail And that means that you are ROR'd, released on recognizance, and basically told to show up for court. And the argument again is that the only purpose of bail, which I somewhat disagree with, is to make sure that you reappear in court. And so as long as people came back to court, that was one measure of success.
Yeah, that's right. So basically, New York law, only allows judges to consider the risk of missing court appearances when they make release decisions. That was already the case pre-bail reform. I believe that's been like that since the 60s or so. And that was not changed with bail reform. But as you rightly point out, a lot of cases, like basically all misdemeanors and non-violent felonies, with certain exceptions, were made bail ineligible. In other words, judges no longer had the option to use bail or remand for those types of cases in any circumstance. At the same time, there's a default presumption of release on recognizance, unless there's a certain flight risk. In which case, for the bail ineligible cases, you can also impose pretrial supervision or perhaps electronic monitoring, which has been used a little bit, but it's really primarily pretrial supervision that's used in lieu of bail.
Let me also, so
Yeah.
as a term, it always sounds better. There isn't really any supervision or pre-trial supervision. It usually means you have to call in once or twice a week and basically say, I'm
Well,
still here.
it
And
depends
you're
a
offered
little bit.
services.
Right. So supervision was made universally available to all cases, also with bail reform. So pre-bail reform, violent felony cases were not eligible for pretrial supervision, just didn't exist. So that became a thing. And violent felonies, for the most part, are still or remained bail eligible. But we still saw reductions in bail setting and remand rates, even among those violent felonies, because judges, especially in New York City, but also upstate, started using pretrial supervision in lieu of bail, even though bail was still permitted, right? So we still, even for the eligible cases, we saw an impact on bail setting rates post reform.
And let me just mention, because it's not the point of your study, but it is always sort of the elephant in the room of bail reform, that dangerousness standard, which I don't think we're going to talk about, but it's important to mention. So it's never, every state in the union in DC allows judges to determine if this person is dangerous. Sometimes there's a formal, standard or metrics. Other times I imagine it's more discretionary. But let's say there's a very violent person. He's arrested for something minor this time. He's got pending trials, and a judge can say, you're just dangerous. You're going to go out there and hurt people and hold you. So that is expressly forbidden in New York. Now, it always has been, but there were workarounds before bail reform. And so those workarounds have been closed. So that's a sort of a separate issue that people are like, why are these dangerous people being released? But that's not the point of your study. And so
Yeah, no, I mean, let's maybe talk about this a couple of minutes before I go into the studies, because I think it is an important context. For what it's worth, and maybe, that's my interpretation of the data. I don't have real evidence, like I can't prove this, but I think it's pretty obvious when you look at release decisions, especially for violent felonies, which are, again, almost all of them are still eligible for bail. When you look at release decisions in New York City and outside of New York City, you see that judges outside of the city release way fewer of those violent felonies. So in other words, they and violent felonies, by the way, have the lowest rates of failure to appear in court. So if we really go with the premise that judges only consider failure to appear in court with their release decisions, I think the empirical data, you know, kind of challenges that perception, because again, like we have violent felonies who have very low FTA rates. FTA is failure to appear, compared to misdemeanors and non-violent felonies, and yet they're held a lot more often, and they're held more often outside of the city by quite a margin than in the city. So in other words, you have different judicial cultures, different, in the city and outside of the city, and that kind of seems to interact with the law. So, why are violent felonies held even though they have such low FTA rates? I would think that some judges subconsciously or consciously do consider dangerousness when they make release decisions. So that's just a side note, I think I
Why
think
did you
there.
think their FTA is lower? Their ability to appear is better. Is that because more of the misdemeanors are just so socially and mentally dysfunctional, or?
I mean, that's definitely, I think that's one valid theory. The short answer is I don't really know, but that would be one of my first go-to reasons as well. And for what it's worth, of course, there's a selection bias. A lot of VFOs are held. So you could say maybe the ones that are held have this huge FTA risk and the ones who are released don't. But when you actually use we in a paper that we recently published last year, also with Stephen, we used out of sample predictions to kind of project an FTA rate to those VFOs that were held rather than released. And the models strongly suggest that the FTA rates would be very similar if more VFOs were also released. And I think it does have to do with, like, if you look at low level repeat offenders. I think there's probably a higher share of people with mental health issues than among violent offenders, which might sound somewhat counterintuitive, but it, I think it does make sense to people who are familiar with the system. Stephen, do you have any other idea why we might see those low FDA rates with the VFOs?
One going thing is that the stakes are higher in those cases, which provides additional motivation for people to show up to court. If I could just go back and add a point about the law itself, because it is worth underlining there's a tension in the law. So on the one hand, judges in New York are not allowed to consider dangerousness. They are only allowed to consider flight risk. But on the other, when legislators decided what type of charges to leave eligible for bail or remand, they selected mostly violent felonies. And that runs, as we pointed out, contrary to the data. These people are not that high at risk for flight. But the thinking behind that law is probably that these people are at higher risk for additional violent felonies. So the law itself does reflect this concern for dangerousness. It's not just the de facto practices of judges that they're holding people who are charged with VFOs.
Do you know? I don't mind if you speculate. I don't want you to speculate to things you're not comfortable with. But these decisions, how much does the prosecutor? What's the role of the prosecutor versus the role of the judge on someone being asked, to not be released?
That's a good question, Stephen. Do you have a guess on that? I don't really.
I don't have a database answer for that. I know that the prosecutor makes their case. They consider the risk assessment that's done in New York. They occasionally highlight what the risk assessment says. But in the end, it's unclear the degree to which that recommendation influences judge decisions.
Thinking because the Brooklyn DA Eric Gonzalez and one report that I saw from a few years ago, said that they want to, at every opportunity, to consider non-incarceration alternatives, and perhaps if they don't ask anyway, the judge doesn't listen. But let's focus on your data and the effects of bail reform. I can say what I summarize. And you can let me know if I'm missing the main point or if I'm getting it wrong. And then I would do what I'd like to ask you is some about methods, but also how the law is the law perfect as is, as some politicians could it be improved, and would you go so far as to say it works or doesn't work, or is it nuanced, as I started this little session by saying. But the summary, the important part seems to me is that, which I just scrolled off of for no good reason, sources, executive summary I'm looking at. You make a big distinction between low risk and high risk subgroups, and high risk is defined, correct me if I'm wrong, as somebody who has an open pending case at the time they are rearrested. Is that right?
Okay, so that's correct in the time series study that Stephen and I co-authored. So in the other paper where we have the 50-month tracking period, high risk is defined slightly differently, and I can explain why we did it differently, which is mostly data driven. It's about data availability rather than anything else really, but. the high risk groups in the study with the 50-month follow-up.
And just so people know, this is the October 2025 study.
That's right. That's the October 2025 study. Looks at the current version of bail reform rather than the initial version that was in effect during the first half. And here we define low and high risk. So low risk people are people who have no recent criminal history at all. In other words, they have no recent prior arrest that was prosecuted. And by recent, I mean within the last 2.5 years of their current case's arraignment. The reason why it's 2.5 years is because we had data back to 2017, and that's as far as we could go, basically. The other low-risk group is slightly less exclusive. That is people that may have a prior, but that don't have a prior violent felony arrest. So it's a less exclusive low-risk group. The high-risk groups are the inverse of that. So one high-risk group is people with any recent criminal history, so any prosecuted arrest within the last 2.5 years. And then we have the more exclusive high-risk group, which is people who have at least one violent felony arrest within the last 2.5 years.
Are these the definition of violent felony? Is that based on this? Is what is the person is arrested for, or then
that's what the person is arrested for? And
okay.
And when I say prior arrests, that includes arrests that didn't end up in a conviction. As long as they were prosecuted, we consider that as a criminal history in our study.
What and if it was, what if it wasn't prosecuted? Because most cases aren't, right?
Well, most VFOs, I think, are, for example, if it wasn't prosecuted, that it wouldn't show up in the court data. So in that study, we wouldn't know about non-prosecuted prior arrests. But what's important here to keep in mind is, we basically compare two different groups. We compare people who were released without bail, and we compare that to statistically similar people who were held on bail or who faced bail or were remanded. And the definition of prior criminal history is the same for both groups. So yes, I mean, in a perfect world, we would know about any arrest, whether prosecuted or not in the past, but it doesn't really bias our results because both groups are affected by the same type of limitation.
Okay, because I'm thinking, I mean, it's publicly available data, but originally it was Hannah Myers who wrote a paper on the rise in of cases that were dropped post discovery, and presumably because of discovery reform. But I mention it, and because there are huge variances both within the 5 counties of New York City, and also for New York City versus out of New York City, and it's more than half of all cases in New York City now that are not prosecuted. So that could, and I think it's like a third or something outside. I'm not certain, outside of New York City. Mm-hmm. But that could be a key bit of, I don't know. There might be something there.
No, let me go right into that, because that's a common question, and it's a very valid question. We should be concerned about any biases or any differences that apply to the two groups, like our control and our treatment group, differently, and how that might bias our results. And that's also the reason why we have 2 time series analyses. That's the November 2025 study that just came out the other day, and then the equivalent study, the sister study, if you will, that came out a year ago, that was for New York City rather than the rest of the state.
Let me just say the titles of these so people can find them more easily. If you go to the Data Collaborative for Justice, you can Google that and click on reports. The October study is testing the long-term impacts of bail reform across New York State, a quasi-experimental evaluation. And the November study is examining the impact of eliminating bail on recidivism in the New York City suburbs and upstate regions, a difference in differences study. Boy, that's going to get everyone's. Those are going to jump off the.
It's catchy. Stephen, maybe this is a good time to explain a little bit what the differences in difference design does, because I think it speaks directly to Peter's concern about, maybe prosecutorial behavior might bias our results. And I think with the DID, short for difference in difference design, that design really accounts for that potential bias. In a way that other methods don't.
But I think it's worth first drawing out where the potential bias can come from in that situation in particular. So you said that in your matched treatment and control cases, everybody was similar in terms of prosecuted prior VFO cases, right?
That's right. Yep.
But if there are unobserved, non-prosecuted VFO cases that are more common among the people who were bailed versus the people who were released, that would introduce a potential source of bias. Right. This is
exactly.
I'm just spelling it out because this is one of the big concerns that we have when it comes to endogeneity with judge decisions, meaning specifically that judges are deciding who to hold either through monetary bail or remand, and whether or not they're holding people based on characteristics that we can't see in the data. All right, so that is a problem that is not as pronounced when it comes to other methods. For example, with difference in differences, and this is where I suppose it makes sense to explain what's going on under the hood with a DID analysis.
Please do.
All right, so there are two things that are needed to do DID. It's very straightforward, and it addresses two particular problems. So imagine a very crude situation where all you have is data before an intervention and after. So you have a pre-post analysis, and stats 101, we know there's potential confounding. We can't make attributions about changes that happen after the reform and assume that they're happening because of the reform, because all sorts of other things are occurring at the same time. How do you solve that problem? With the control group. That's one standard way of doing it. And with a DID, all you need are two things. You need a period before reform, a period after reform, and a control group. All right. The second big problem that I just mentioned is endogeneity. So how do we solve that problem with a DID? So when you have cases assigned to either treatment or control, what you look for is some sort of exogenous shock that, in a way that is somewhat random, is leading people into treatment versus control. And this is different than a situation where a judge is deciding whether a person is bailed or not, because the assumption is that it's somewhat random whether or not a person has an eligible charge or an ineligible charge. So the advantage of this type of approach is that it's solving two big problems. It's not just a pre-post. Now we have a comparison group, and also we have this exogenous shock that is helping us deal with the issue of endogeneity, the bias of selecting certain types of cases based on both observable and unobservable risk factors.
Thing to add, what's important here is the tracking period. So the number of or the period in which we count rearrests for every person, right? That in the differences design, that tracking period is the exact same period for both the treatment group, that is bail ineligible cases, the treatment being elimination of bail. And it's the exact same for the control group, which is cases where bail remained an option for judges. And we basically the time period, like suppose you have one person arraigned on a bail eligible charge on December 30th, 2019, and January 1, 2020, and you have another person arraigned on a bail ineligible charge on January 1, 2020. The 2-year tracking period follows both of those individuals until January 1, 2022. So any changes in policing or in prosecutorial behavior or because of COVID would apply to both of those individuals. And therefore, we don't have this problem of a pre-post bias with the DID design, which really solved a big issue, especially because of something like COVID. And how prosecutors reacted to COVID and how police reacted to COVID and the George Floyd protests, for example.
And I hope I don't get this wrong because I don't fully understand it. But endogeneity is basically when you have, when either the independent or dependent variable is linked to other things not being accounted for. Is that a good way to summarize it? So like
right, yep.
In this case, for example, perhaps, you have two cases that seem similar based on the data you have, which is a type of crime, but perhaps the judge knows that one crime was much more brutal based on the details of the case that doesn't come through to you, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
That's
and
right,
then if you
Well, you call it omitted variable bias, the third variable problem.
Okay.
But just to use the example we had before, so imagine that prior VFO arrests that don't lead to convictions are predictors of both the treatment here, i.e. bail or remand, and future reoffending.
And now, okay,
And
now
that
my
opens
mind's
the door,
slowly clicking along.
that opens the back door to bias.
And how does difference in difference methods take? How does that help this?
So we're not assigning people based on the judge's decision. We're assigning them based on eligibility alone.
Okay.
So the treatment cases became ineligible, and the control cases remained eligible.
Control. Okay.
And that had nothing to do with criminal history. That was purely based on the instant charge, right?
And then the changes in bail reform, does that help this give you more options to look at stuff, or is that sort of or does that make things messier?
The latter.
No.
Yeah.
Which also explains why the DID study was done with just the initial reform.
Okay. So, going back to low and high risk groups, what did you find? Or I could summarize it, but why don't you summarize it? You're here.
Yeah, let me give a very high level overview, because the overall story, if you will, is very similar across all 5 studies, including the one that looks at the current version of bail reform, where more charges or more cases are bail eligible once again, but like the overall story didn't change, unfortunately. And it's the following. Let me start with part 1 that some people like to focus on, and then I get to part 2, which other people like to focus on. So the first one is, the legislators who introduced bail reform explicitly said that the goal of bail reform is to release more people without bail and to use less pretrial incarceration while maintaining public safety, right? And by that very narrow measure, bail reform was, if you will, successful. We didn't see recidivism increases either for people directly affected by reform or even in the aggregate. What we did find actually in New York City is recidivism decreases among the bail ineligible group. That being said, that kind of answers the question: did what was stipulated by bail reform proponents actually happen? And I guess it did in the aggregate. The other part of the story, which should not be overlooked, is the detrimental effects among high-risk individuals. And again, across
before you get into that, if I could just elaborate a little bit on, why perhaps recidivism went down. I don't mean recidivism. I'm sorry. Why appearance in court increased slightly among people not detained with bail. Just like to point, for certain low level offenses, if you get arrested and detained, you might get fired. A relationship might break up. Whatever problems you were having before will not be. I mean, there's a good chance you're unemployed too. Let's be honest, in the real world, if you're getting arrested for low-level offenses. But people have jobs, and they get arrested and they lose those jobs, and therefore their life becomes a lot worse quite quickly. So things can spiral out of control.
Exactly, and I think actually let me take one quick step back here about the different mechanisms that we think are behind our findings. Right? You just pointed one out. It's often referred to as the criminogenic effects of incarceration. And that basically means, exactly as you pointed out, people get locked up and they might lose their job because of it. Family connections suffer. Maybe any mental health problems they have might be exacerbated, especially in an environment like Rikers Island. And because of that, future offending may become more likely once people are released again. So that's called the criminogenic effect. And that is arguably a stronger effect for people who are first-time offenders. They're arrested for the first time. They might still have a job. They might have still intact family connections. There's a lot to lose, right? On the other hand, recidivism under reform may increase because, well, there's no incapacitation, right? Like, people aren't locked up, so they have an immediate opportunity to reoffend rather than being locked up for several days or even weeks, which kind of introduces a delay. And on top of that, there might be a lack of a deterrent effect, right? People might be more likely to offend if they think that they won't be held pre-trial. So those are kind of the countervailing forces behind our results. And what we see is that, among those high risk individuals, we see recidivism increases because, as I said, there's probably not much criminogenic effect left for someone who has been arrested several times or who has a history of violent felonies. But incapacitation matters quite a bit, and perhaps deterrence also matters. On the other hand, for those low risk individuals, for example, people with no criminal history whatsoever, incapacitation might only play a minor role in changing their reoffense risk, but the criminogenic effects, the things they lose while they're detained pre-trial, might have a really bad effect on their future behavior. So that's kind of how those different mechanisms work. The criminogenic effects are stronger among the low-risk individuals, and the incapacitation effects are stronger among those types of high-risk individuals. Where if they're not detained pre-trial, we just see an increased recidivism risk.
I'm looking at the October study. Over the 50-month follow-up period, the rearrest rates decreased from 66 to 57%. And that was seen among all different categories, those categories being felony and violent. Well, misdemeanor, felony.
Yeah, so any rearrest would be any felony, whether violent or non-violent, or any misdemeanor. We didn't look at violations or infractions or any of that.
And then, so I mean, the key distinction here seems to be among basically the frequent super recidivists. Bail reform seems to have failed on us. I mean, especially the more violent ones, but for which is under 15%, I believe, right, of the total arrests.
Something like people with recent prior violent felony arrests is about 15% of the sample.
The reason this strikes me so important is because you have identified the group for whom bail reform has failed. There it is. It's that group, and it seems like the law could be changed to specifically address that group.
That's right. So and in a way, like the July 2020 amendments, as I already mentioned, they reintroduced bail eligibility for certain cases, and we actually looked at the impact of those amendments, and they did reduce recidivism among those cases that were becoming bail eligible once again in July. So the 2020 amendments basically introduced bail eligibility for certain cases like misdemeanor domestic violence cases, burglary 2, subsection 2 cases, which is actually a violent felony that was initially made bail ineligible, and then also the harm cases, so-called harm cases. Real quick, a harm case means that the person is currently accused of a crime that involves harm to person or property, and that person also has an open pending case that meets the same criterion. And that kind of is, again, what Stephen mentioned earlier, that was most likely introduced for public safety considerations. And the attempt.
So, can I just say, this is to show my bias. Also, for common sense, you've got an open pending violent case and you get rearrested. Like at some point, I lose patience with what cops despair just catch and release.
Violent and harm case. It depends who you ask, right? Like a harm, like there's violent felonies and then there's harm cases. Like for example, misdemeanors like petty larceny would be a harm case. You harm someone when you steal, but it's not generally considered. Most people wouldn't consider that a violent crime for what it's worth. But in other words, like long story short, I think those amendments tried to address those increased recidivism rates among certain high-risk people. The issue is that even after those amendments were passed, and that's what our study shows with the 50-month follow-up period, is that we still see increased recidivism rates for people with recent prior arrests, even though most people with a pending case were made eligible once again. So in other words, those amendments had probably in spirit something that you just mentioned. Why not address those high-risk individuals? But I think they didn't fully address the problem. They solved the problem at the margins, but we still see those increased recidivism rates among people with recent criminal histories. despite those amendments. So
yeah,
you know,
and if I remember correctly, I don't think that was the point of those amendments was that some of the crimes that were considered bail ineligible were just absurd. And, you know, there were things like a burglar having rights to access your house for the defense of their case or their legal team. There was a lot of kookiness. I thought it was more just to sand off those extremely rough edges. But I may be remembering it wrong as well. What's an example of a crime that doesn't have harm then by that harm definition? If petty larceny doesn't count?
the way we defined it, and again, like it's not clearly defined, it's not neatly defined in the law. Even though I think they did specify that petty larceny is a harm crime. I think that was the 2022 or 23 amendment where they made this explicitly clear. What wouldn't be a harm case would be low-level drug possession. By our definition, that seems reasonable to us, right? Like if you're caught with a very small amount of drugs, no harm. But that doesn't mean that no judge would consider that a non-harm case either. Again, it's not specified by the law, but we think that most judges look at low-level drug possession and don't consider that a harm case.
Yeah, just think of the whole category of victimless crimes, like prostitution, drug, etc.
Right. Those, though, now are a pretty small percentage of overall arrests, I think.
Yeah, exactly. So like most cases are indeed harm case. Well, a harm case, another stipulation is it has to be a misdemeanor or up. So B misdemeanors, whatever they are, don't count as a harm case. That's another restriction. But you're right. The vast majority of cases are harm cases. That's correct. At least, again, by the way when we read the law, what we would consider a harm case, what we think a reasonable judge would consider a harm case, that's what we came up with, yeah.
So short of giving judges the discretion to detain people for the dangerousness standard that everybody else uses, how would you change this law to specifically to take care of the group that recidivism has increased? What should it say?
I mean, I think there's a menu of options, and I think depending on who you ask, there's different opinions on what options should be used, right? So let's start with a fairly obvious one. You can go back to the old system, right? Like we know how it worked because it was reality. So you could say, okay, let's just make those eligible once again for bail, right? That would be one option. Another
but the old
option
system did it in a different way. That just had, I mean, that was a net that was catching a lot more fish. Here you're talking about people that have open pending cases, right, and violent cases. That's not quite the old system. And I'm trying to get the best of both worlds of keeping the benefits of the low risk group.
Okay, so what you could say, like, okay. Let's talk about it normatively for a second, right? If you believe that a harm case should be eligible for bail, then I think it's kind of hard to argue normatively that somebody who was arrested somebody who has a recent prior arrest that was disposed a day before you were rearrested should not be bail eligible, right? Like just because their bail case was disposed and the other person's case is not yet disposed, one is eligible for bail and one isn't. It just doesn't make a lot of sense, I think. And again, I'm reading tea leaves here because I don't know what the intentions exactly were, but when you allow having a pending case to be considered as a factor for bail eligibility, I guess it speaks to recent criminal justice involvement or recent offending.
So we could just put a time thing on it then of 1 month, 6 months, a year, whatever.
You could do that, and that's currently being done by the CJA release assessment, right? That looks at FTA risk, failure to appear in court risk. But that release assessment looks at whether the person is a pending case, but it also looks at whether the person has a felony conviction within the last 10 years or a misdemeanor conviction within the last 3 years. So those time cutoffs are being used in New York City already to inform release decisions just for failure to appear, but not for safety risk, right? So yeah, that would be, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but I'm thinking that there's nothing in the New York Constitution that would prevent lawmakers from writing it that way. That would be one option. The other option, and they're not mutually exclusive, of course, is to say, okay, there are certain services that are provided pre-trial for people who are now released and who were previously generally held, primarily pre-trial supervision, right? Pre-trial supervision can mean a lot of things, and it works quite differently in across the state. It's a different model in New York City than in other smaller counties where it's quite unclear what actually exactly happens. So you could perhaps say, okay, we provide more intense pretrial services, maybe where people have more consequences if if there's pretrial misconduct or something like that. That would be another option. That's if you release more people, but you don't provide them with the right services or resources that might actually help them not reoffend. Well, then that's not ideal either, right? So those are the two big options. That's the menu of options, I think. You can provide more pretrial services for those who are released, or you can reduce the number of people who are released based on some type of, risk assessment or release assessment. Or the third option, which again is not mutually exclusive with the other two, is, as you say, you could allow a dangerousness consideration, even though personally I'm fairly skeptical that that would change the equation all that much. We don't have to go into why, but I think normatively it makes sense, but empirically I would be surprised if it really changes release behavior or traditional decision making all that much.
Well, it would allow for outliers to be considered, because I think the normative standard, I mean, some of it is the public. I think most people, not everyone, are willing to give people second and even third chances. But, when you see, and there's some bad case in the New York Post, and well, they'll get that guy, and we're going to see, is he going to have 10 or 30, prior arrests and 4 felony convictions? And not only, do I think that's morally wrong, it very much is used to sap support for other reforms that are beneficial. Like, it seems like advocates of bail reform should be much more concerned about the negative effects, even if it's a small chunk of the group. But we need to fix those things. Not only is it the right thing to do, but it helps the political cause as well, if that is your cause. But
right, yeah, there would be a public safety benefit to addressing this one way or another, and there would also be a PR benefit, if you will, for bail reform, right? It's like it would take a lot of wind out of the sails of the New York Post writers, for example, if the types of people that are appearing in story after story were actually eligible for bail.
Yeah. Stephen, any thoughts?
Yeah, so if I could just frame it somewhat differently. So prior to the reform, judges could consider any factor under the sun. That's the pre-reform landscape for bail setting. During the initial reform, they could consider only one factor. And actually, they're not even considering it. It's just a categorical rule that says certain offenses are eligible, other offenses are not. Then we moved into a third phase where we said, we're going to include certain categories of criminal history factors, including pending case, probation or parole, persistent felony offending past. But those are only a handful of factors, and I think one of the big issues is that those categories are somewhat crude, and they make these distinctions that seem somewhat absurd. Like René was pointing out, you could have a pending case, but the prior arrest or the prior conviction that happened and was concluded the day before couldn't be considered. So where can we go from here? I think there are two approaches, at least. One is to, on an ad hoc basis, continue to add categories. So we find that people with prior convictions are also at higher risk. So now we add some flexibility, and judges consider that category now. But we still have other categories. I think we're sort of eating away at the corners here, but there's still always going to be other exceptions. And in the absence of the ability to consider all factors, we may still have issues. I think one way to address that, this is the other component of it, is that instead of allowing judges to consider all factors under the sun without any evidence for considering those factors, we can move towards a system where dangerousness or pretrial recidivism is directly considered through a risk assessment tool. And by doing so, you could potentially guide judges towards the factors that matter the most.
And there are lots of examples that we could copy from. I mean, it's because it's so standard. Those, we could just take the New Jersey system, which I'm sure isn't perfect, but seems to work pretty okay, I suppose. So when you see people just take your reports and say it, yep, you have proven that bail reform works, do you tear your hair out, or do you go, that's a good summary of what we've done?
I mean, frankly, the first bail reform report that I authored came out about 2.5 years ago. So I've been kind of following that debate relatively closely because, it's professionally relevant to me. I've noticed this from both sides of the spectrum. Like, people will cherry pick the results that support their views or their agenda the most, right? And I'm beyond pulling my hair out. Like, it's not really I'm pulling my hair out. It's just something that I suppose I somewhat accept it as the nature of the political discourse, and that's not just about bail reform. It's like every topic under the sun, you will have that, right? So, what I have to say though about the way that bail reform is covered and has been covered, and I don't want to necessarily toot my own horn here too much, but I think there was somewhat of a shift on both ends of the spectrum to allow for more nuance. I think 3-4 years ago, and again, maybe my intuition is wrong. Maybe, this is somewhat anecdotal based on my reading of the media, but opponents of bail reform were much more in the camp of, with this whole thing needs to be repealed when it just first passed, right? And proponents of bail reform were much more in the camp of everything is perfect and nice and dandy when the thing just passed. I think now that the evidence is in over several studies, and we see that those effects really vary depending on who's released or who's eligible for bail. I feel like I've detected more nuance on both ends, where it's like, okay, we still want to make significant changes to bail reform. That's what the critics say, but it doesn't have to be thrown out completely. And on the other hand, proponents of bail reform are still happy with it, but they will admit that maybe certain tweaks would further improve the law, or would improve the law, right? So I think I think if you present people with evidence and you try to explain to them why that evidence is reliable, right? Like and the studies and the research needs to be done by people who don't start with the answer, they start with the question. And I think if you can do this convincingly, I like to think that there's some persuasion behind that. That's kind of my answer. Stephen, any thoughts on that?
Just zooming out a bit, I mean, at the national level, one thing I bristle at is generalizations about bail reform. I mean, the range of bail reforms that have been implemented across the United States has been enormous, and it's included very mild discretionary reforms where, for example, prosecutors stop requesting bail. That's a bail reform. We've had other injunctions of imposing just bail for certain types of offenses, but at the same time, pretrial detention is allowed for those individuals. So there's always a backdoor to detain people who are at high risk. There are often comparisons to New Jersey. New Jersey, through a raft of reforms, effectively eliminated money bail, but still detains roughly 20% of people pre-trial based on risk. So there's a range of options, and making generalizations about bail reform doesn't capture the nuance of all the types of reforms that have been undertaken in the U.S. And that even applies within New York alone. And New York has gone through several different phases of reform. So to say anything about New York's reform often misses the changes that we've seen, some of which have been very dramatic.
Is there something in your reports that people, is there some nugget down there that maybe isn't in the executive summary that should be getting more attention and isn't?
I think we try to really put the important gist in the executive summary. One thing maybe I think it's actually also part of the summary, but it's not a major part of it. You can focus on the high risk individuals and talk about recidivism rates. But what we also found is for certain subgroups, we found no changes in recidivism rates, but we found increases in the frequency of subsequent arrests. And that basically means we found that fewer people were rearrested, but among those who were rearrested, those were rearrested more often throughout the tracking period, which kind of speaks to this repeat offending issue.
Yeah, I did notice that, and I was really happy to included that because the last time I downloaded and crunched the data, there was just basically a "Have you been rearrested or not?" category.
Right, and that's okay. I mean, I could go into stats talk right now, but just to scratch on the surface, right? Like a binary measure like that is kind of more robust. And by robust, I mean more reliable, because when you count
Statistically reliable, you mean?
Statistically reliable,
Yeah.
because when you count rearrests, not everybody who offends is arrested every single time, right? But somebody who offends often enough during a 50-month period is probably going to get arrested at least once. And actually, that's a thought that a prosecutor pointed out to me when I presented at the Manhattan DA's office. It was like, I talked to them about the idea of like including a measure that looks at the count of rearrests, but they were saying, it might be actually more sensitive to certain changes in policing and whatnot than like a binary measure. But I agree with you, and that's the reason we included it this time. And frankly, the first time we did the study, we conducted several different subgroup analyses. We did separate analyses for upstate at New York City and for bail eligibles and ineligibles, and adding yet another outcome measure that basically doubles the size of the paper seemed kind of impractical for the reader. But because of this repeat reoffending debate, I think it seemed more and more important to look at the count of recidivism and of rearrests, I should say. And I agree. It's an important new feature of this study that just offers a little more insight.
I'm buried in page 16 of one of the October report for recent prior violent felony offense arrest, VFO arrests. I mean, the numbers are disturbingly. We're talking about violent felonies here. They're scary. Any rearrest is in 80+%. Felony arrest 70%. Violent felony rearrest has gone up to 46%. I mean, that's a lot of people being hurt out there. And we can identify the group. I mean, that's why I emphasize this is not to sound like a New York Post headline, but to say, wow, this could be fixed.
That's right. And for what it's worth, among the low risk individuals, you saw decreases in violent felony recidivism as well. And I think that's just an important context. Like, not only did we quote unquote gain violent felony rearrests among the high risk people, we actually also spared ourselves from violent felony reoffenses among the low risk people. So that's why we, in the aggregate, we kind of find no effects in either direction for the most part, or even decreases in New York, because there's way more low risk people than high risk people. But that being said, yes, you're right. I think any violent crime that's been committed is one too many, and if there's a way to address this by identifying the high risk groups in a reliable way and treating them differently than currently to reduce that, I think we should do that. Yeah.
When I mentioned your study on Tuesday to a classroom full of cops, they were like, well, yeah, we're not arresting people like we used to, which isn't quite true because the number of arrests have been going up actually since 2020. But what do you say to that idea that the data is greatly influenced by the fact that cops have stopped arresting people knowing that they're going to be released, or for a variety of reasons?
Okay, that again is comes back to a design question, right? Like, okay, let me start with the study that has the 50-month follow-up period. So, Stephen, do you mind muting again? I'm sorry to do this to you. So with the 50-month follow-up period, like, we're basically comparing people who are arraigned pre-reform, that is, people who were arraigned between July and October 2019. And our treatment group are those who were released under reform That is people who were arraigned between July and October 2020, right? So basically, suppose somebody who was arraigned in October 2019, we tracked that one individual to the end of 2023, 50 months, 4 years and 2 months. A person who was arraigned in October 2020, we tracked that individual till December 2024, right? And as you just pointed out, at the very latest, by 2022, arrest numbers were back up again, and then we had still at least 1 year or even 2 years of tracking period where things were sort of kind of back to normal again, and on top of that, the two groups out of those 50 months tracking period, 38 months overlap between those two groups, right? So they're exposed to the same exact external external things that happened around that time the same way, right? And again, for violent felony arrests are much less affected by policing changes, right? Because if there's a call for a violent crime, cops are going to respond to that. Generally speaking, for misdemeanors, it might be a little different, right?
Yeah.
So, and we see those patterns, the same patterns for VFOs that we see for felonies and for misdemeanors, which to me suggests that bias is not anything that we should be too concerned about. That's in that one study. Again, back to the other study that I co-authored with Stephen, in the Difference in Differences study, both groups were arraigned basically anytime between January 2019 and June 2020. So here the tracking period for both the treatment and the control group is actually the exact same time period. So anything that might have affected policing in a way that fewer people were arrested would have affected both groups the same way, right? Suppose a cop sees a crime being committed in April 2020, right? They will make that arrest or they will not make that arrest. But what doesn't impact that arrest decision is not whether that person had a prior arrest that was eligible or ineligible for bail, right? That doesn't make a lot of sense because they just wouldn't even know that in the first place.
Well, for a few people you actually do, but I think overall your point stands.
Well, fair, yeah.
Yeah.
But I think, again, those external factors that affect the policing, and that's the beauty of the DID design, that's accounted for here. That's basically the same exact mechanisms for the treatment group, bail elimination group, and the control group that is still eligible for bail.
There's one more response to this, which is that if we just assume, for argument's sake, that arrests have gone down dramatically, there is research looking at criminal incidents where New York City was compared to other similar cities looking at criminal incidents, and there was only one crime type that went up after, and it was robbery. This was using a synthetic control method. There was a second study statewide comparing New York State to other states with similar pre-reform trends, and there were no effects whatsoever on a host of serious crime types. So that is looking at criminal incidents and not just relying on an arrest measure, which could be biased based on activity by police.
Right.
I mean, there are questions about whether or not the counterfactuals used in those studies are credible, but at least it's some evidence looking directly at criminal incidents.
Thanks. I want to wrap up soon, just for the sake of anybody who's made it to this far listening. But thank you. But I do want to ask, and you can either just anything that's you want to say that you haven't, but maybe specifically, and I like asking people who analyze data this, what changes would you like in data collection that would really help you out?
Data collection, I think data availability, let's start there, right? Like there's a lot of data that's being collected that's simply not available. And even if it's available, sometimes you can't connect different data sets in a way that actually allows you to do certain analyses, right? For example, DCJS, Division of Criminal Justice Services, and OCA, Office of Court Administration, those two data sets have different limitations. And it's always a payoff which one you use. And the public OCA/DCJS dataset attempts to limit some of those, or remedy some of those limitations by throwing their data together basically. But then, as you say, that public data set is also limited. It only has a binary rearrest measure. It only has a pretrial rearrest measure, etc. So, and there is very detailed data that's being collected that is generally not available, and not only to the public but also to the non-public, right? Like the data we used for the study with the 50-month tracking period is based on non-public OCA data that allowed us to track recidivism beyond the pretrial period. That's one of the main advantages of that data set, right? But it still has certain limitations, right? Like we only have it back to 2017. We don't have full criminal history. So even though it's being collected and even though it's known, right? So I'm not sure what's currently not being collected that would drastically improve it. What I know is there's a lot of data that is being collected, and we'd all be better off, not just as researchers, but also as the public, if that was much more readily available. If not to everybody, at least to researchers. That's kind of my view on this.
Why do you think it's not? Is it just bureaucracy in action, or is it a plot?
I think I think it is, a lot of it is probably bureaucracy. I think there's, I'm not sure about plots. Like, for example, let me give you an example. Raise the age, right? Which is, of course, the law that raised the age of criminal responsibility from 16 and 17 up to 18, right? And part of the law is basically that family court is the type of court where youths go to now, or even 16 and 17-year-olds go to family court rather than to adult criminal court now. There's criminal court data, and then there's also Supreme Court data that you can look at, but family court is a black box. All we know from the court data is that they were transferred to family court. We don't know anything beyond that point. We don't know whether they were held. We don't know any services they might have received pre-trial. We don't know even when their case was disposed, right? We don't know any of those things. You can still do certain things with that, but it's a big limitation. And I don't, again, I'm not a lawyer. I wasn't there when the law was written. My understanding is when it comes to minors, there's just this an elevated concern about privacy. And that's not just in criminal justice, that's also in other spheres as well, right? So I think when it comes to raise the age, it is a feature of the law rather than a bug that like that type of data is being kept private and not available. Or at least it's considered a feature. From a research perspective, it's certainly a huge limitation, right? But I'm not sure if I would call it a plot. I think there are probably legitimate reasons to not give everybody all the data about 16-year-olds that were arrested for things,
I will mention in the plot context, the only time in my life I've ever been asked to censor myself was I was giving a talk at a certain New York State agency and was told, please don't talk about bail reform. And I said, I won't, but why should I? That's not what I'm here to talk about. And he said, because Andrew Cuomo supports it and he signs my paycheck. And I thought, wow, if that is the feeling in this organization, that they're so scared of Andrew Cuomo and vengeance that might come down, I was like, that was not a healthy sign. I also lost some... I became a bit disillusioned with Raise the Age because there were clearly negative effects on like 15-year-olds, and shootings went up. Again, it was nuanced. It didn't seem bad for everybody, but there was an identifiable segment for whom things got worse, and nobody seemed to care. Like it was simply about reducing the criminal justice footprint, criminal legal footprint on people, and I was like, but they're people that are anyway. That bothered me somewhat. That there didn't seem to be any real effort to make it better. It was just always ratcheting down the carceral system, as they say. So that's what I worry about. And when I say plot, I was being a bit facetious, but maybe driven by ideologues is a better description of what I was getting at. But
I mean, I think it's fair to say that everyone has their biases and it might affect how they conduct themselves. The Cuomo story you just told, everyone has certain dependencies here, right? As well, like and people need to pay their bills and they don't want to, put themselves into jeopardy over things like that. But I honestly don't have the insights to have any opinion on whether how much malice versus bureaucracy versus just, oh, I didn't think about this, is going on here.
Stephen, any thoughts? But I will say, before your thoughts, I will say that's why I appreciate your reports, because I do know that I can trust your intellectual integrity in these matters, and so I read these reports when I can focus on what it says rather than, is this the real story? Because I think you do present the real story as the data lets you.
I know the plot theory is good for clicks, but unfortunately it doesn't really apply here, especially when it comes to bail. So in the initial bail reform law, there was a requirement that data on bail and risk factors were collected and released, and every 6 months there's a beautiful public data set online where you can run your own analyses with a fairly rich data set. And I don't think other states that have undertaking reforms like this have been as transparent as New York has.
That's good to know.
Yeah, that's a good point. New York is actually, in terms of, that's a good point. As a researcher, I always want more data. That's my own bias, right? But it's true, like in the national context, New York is in a very solid spot when it comes to data transparency compared to the rest of the country.
Any other thoughts, comments, questions? I really appreciate your time, and you've certainly helped me understand it a little better, and hopefully other people as well. And if there's a 6th report, then you can come back and talk about that one too. But maybe we'll be happy with the volume of 5.
Yeah, I think for the time being, we're good on bail reform reports, but who knows? There might be future changes.
Are you working on something else you can or want to talk about?
Yes, so one study that we plan to do, and we already secured funding for it, and we will get started on it soon, is an evaluation of supervised release. That might be something that excites you, because I know you're skeptical of it. And that evaluation will use a very rigorous method to really try to isolate the causal effect of supervised release compared to both ROR and to bail/remand.
I predict you're going to find a very similar result, which is beneficial for a lot of people because of the services provided, and there is the high-risk group that laughs at it and takes advantage of it, but we shall see.
We shall see, exactly. So, you'll be included on the email blast when that one comes out.
All right.
It's a little down the road, though.
Okay, thanks again. This is Peter Moskos. I'm here with René Ropac and Stephen Koppel, and they both just released study for the Data Collaborative for Justice at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, my own school, and they are senior research associates there. Thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Peter.
Thanks so much, Peter. Take care.
Bye.